This morning is my favorite ordinary Sunday of the year, Mennonite Heritage Sunday. For the Sunday is a chance for us to remember the people and the events that have helped contribute to our faith and our tradition. It's a chance for us to focus our attention on those that have come before. Today, the Mennonite Church has asked us to talk about witness. And I've been thinking about the unique way that Mennonites have been able to contribute to the larger society. For a while, Mennonites have never been a large denomination. We have left a remarkable mark on our world, and we have contributed in so many ways to make it more peaceful and loving and whole. Over the years, I've noticed a pattern to Mennonites' most successful ways of witnessing. We see a gap in the society, a crack of injustice that is plaguing our world, one that others seem to be overlooking. And then we find a way to bring healing and hope to it, which allows for our world to be a bit more peaceful. This morning, I want to tell 3 stories about this phenomenon. And I hope all the stories both inspire us and remind us of this remarkable tradition to which we belong. But before I get started, let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you for our Mennonite mothers and fathers, those who have tried to live the way of Jesus, those who have worked to bring peace and justice and love to the world in which we live and love. Inspire us through these stories and help us to be more like your Son. Amen. Story 1. If you've ever been to Amsterdam, you know there are canals everywhere. And each year, a significant number of people, they fall into those canals and they drown. Well, in the 18th century, 2 Mennonites, I'm going to butcher their names, Gisbrecht van Bruges and Jacob de Klerk, learned of a need within their community. No one at that time was coming to the aid of those who were falling into the canals and were drowning. Because at that time in Amsterdam and in almost every major city in the world, there was an ordinance that proclaimed it to be illegal to disturb or even help a drowning body, because this would impact whether the police would be able to discern whether a crime or not had been committed if that person drowns. It was a punishable offense to pull someone out of the water and try to help them or resuscitate them. Bodies had to remain there until it was certain that he or she died of natural causes. Well, for Bruges and de Klerk, they decided that this law was nonsense. So together they formed the Society for the Rescue of Drowning Victims in 1767. They got the ordinance changed. They made posters describing how a person that was drowning could be safely saved. They printed 10,000 of these posters and they hung them up all over the city, in every inn, every church, every liquor store. They even offered workshops in the spinning houses and in different workplaces to instruct people on how they could rescue drowning people. The society offered a reward for someone who rescued another from drowning. And that reward was either money or a gold medal. Each rescue had to be confirmed, and after certainty was achieved, the prize was rewarded. On the medal, one received a symbolic engraving of the rescue. On one side, a woman depicting humanity was bent over the drowning person, saving them from death. On the perimeter of that medal, in Latin, you found the phrase, "smothered in water, On his homeland, he is returned to his family. On the other side, the name of the rescuer was engraved. These Mennonites, they started the first of these societies. But quickly, the idea spread like wildfire in all the major cities. And similar societies within 5 years started not only all over Europe, but also in the British Isles, the Caribbean, and even here in North America. And they were all based on the model that was created by Baruch and de Klerk. And in case you're curious, the Society for the Saving of Drowning Victims is still active. It's still training people how to rescue those who are drowning 250 years later. They still reward medals to individuals who successfully rescue others. And they are now the largest research center on the prevention of drowning in the entire world. And you can visit them the next time that you're in Amsterdam. You have to wonder how many tens of thousands have been saved, all because 2 Mennonites recognized an unjust law and then formed a society that worked to change it. Story 2, mental health. You may or may not be aware, but it was Mennonites and others that belonged to peace churches that completely revolutionized mental health in this country in the last century. During World War II, a significant number of men were exempted from military service as conscientious objectors. And about 12,000 of these COs, they were ordered to perform alternative service in the Civilian Public Service, or CPS. And by far the largest percent of those that served in CPS were Mennonites, about 40%. When the war started, CPSers, they traditionally served in infrastructure. They did jobs like soil conservation, fighting forest fires, and building roads. But many CPSers, they longed to do more socially significant work. So they came up with an idea. They approached the selective service and they asked if they could have a unit at a nearby mental hospital. Mental hospitals at that time were facing critical staff shortages before the war. This only was enhanced because of it. And soon, mental hospitals from all over the country, they were requesting CPS units to come and help serve. And by the end of the war, 44 of these units were created to support mental health hospitals in America. During the course of World War II, about 3,000 CPSers served in mental health hospitals. And over half of those that served were Mennonites. The work was brutal. They didn't get paid. They worked 76 hours a week. MCC did provide housing and a stipend of $2.50 a month. But the men, they just were not prepared for the despicable conditions of these hospitals. Often, one worker was responsible for 350 patients at a time. It was not uncommon to find 100 patients living in one 30 by 30 foot room. No treatment was being provided. The space was filthy, stinky, and dark. People got sick and they regularly died. And Paul Gearing recalls of his first impression when he stepped into Howard State Hospital on the first day. My initial reaction was one of shock, he says. I didn't realize and I couldn't believe that these conditions could exist anywhere in our country. Complicating matters, the state, it treated these patients very violently. I mean, how do you deal with 350 people at a time? Many patients were restrained 23 hours a day. They were beaten and abused and tortured. And all this violence, it naturally made the patients more violent. Yet here were 1,500 Mennonites that were serving because they didn't believe in war and they didn't believe in violence. And working at those hospitals, it tested their pacifism. And it also gave them a chance to demonstrate the sincerity and the practicality of their beliefs. Many Mennonites were badly beaten by inmates when they refused to fight back. But over time, over months and years, the hospitals, they began to notice that treating people with love and dignity, it was actually producing more practical and better results in the patients. They learned that maybe they would be able to change some of their violent methods when treating patients. A Quaker, Warren Sawyer, said it best. One of our biggest contributions at Byberry and all other institutions was that we developed a trust of other patients towards us. They knew that they weren't going to be beaten. They knew that they would be treated humanly. And therefore, they stopped acting so violently to us and to others. After the war ended, many of these men and also hundreds of women who volunteered during the war, they couldn't return home as if their lives were not changed by this experience. So they began to speak up about what they had observed in these institutions. Many went public with charges of squalid conditions and widespread abuse. And their testimonies, they created major news all over in the newspapers. Mennonites helped establish the National Mental Health Foundation, which sought reforms based on the CPS's experiences. And they also then founded 8 mental health facilities because they believed there had to be a better way. To support these facilities, they established a committee on the homes for the mentally ill, what we now know today as the Mennonite Mental Health Services. This committee held the titles to those hospitals, and they provided guidance and research and consultation on how to better care for those mental health issues. And 7 of those facilities, I believe, are still operating today. And they're all centered on compassionate, cutting-edge care. These Mennonite men and women, they're just another example of Mennonite witness at its best. People who noticed an injustice that was being overlooked and was plaguing their society, and then they worked tirelessly to bring healing and hope to it. They mended a crack in their society, and thankfully, mental health has been forever changed, even if there is still so much work to do. One final story this morning. The story of Christopher Dock. In the 18th century, at least in the United States, Mennonites didn't care very much about school nor education. At that time, most Mennonites were farmers. And more often than not, families were just content if their children were able to get enough schooling to read the scriptures and to succeed in the demands of a farming economy. And complicating matters, schools at that time, during the colonial age, they used methods that were harsh and severe and violent. Teachers were trained to use fear and beatings to keep kids in line. And Mennonites just had no interest in their kids being part of a system that treated kids that way. One Mennonite, Christopher Dock, though, he knew that he was not meant to be a farmer, that God was calling him to be an educator. But Dock had no interest in working in a school system that treated children harshly and used punishment to motivate. So after immigrating to America in 1714, Dock founded 2 schools in Pennsylvania, and he set out to become a teacher with his own unique style of teaching. And over time, Dock realized that students respond best to a gentle approach based on persuasion and discussion and positive peer pressure. He believed that no rule should ever exist without proper explanation. And instead of threats and punishment, Dock taught that teachers need to go out of their way to express appreciation for the specific ways that an individual student contributed to the larger goals of a classroom. He would even reward his students with pictures of birds and flowers for their hard work. And when students didn't obey, Doc insisted that poor behavior and attitudes, they were best managed with thoughtfulness and understanding. But what really separated Doc from all the other educators of his time was how he focused on the relationship between student and teacher. Each relationship, Doc insisted, offered him a chance to model respect, trust, and mutuality. He worked hard to see each of his students as unique individuals with their different gifts and learning styles. His motto was, different children need different treatment. Doc also believed that the teacher's primary responsibility was just to open up the students' imaginations so they were more curious about exploring God's world. In other words, in his words, he said it was the incarnation of Jesus, the belief in Jesus's kingdom of unconditional love, where we freely give ourselves to others, that really influenced Doc's teaching style. And that's what he tried to embody every day as a teacher. And it's also what made him so loved by his students. So no one was surprised when they learned that Doc died one afternoon after school in his classroom on his knees praying for his students. Christopher Sauer, a father of one of Christopher Doc's students, was so impressed with Doc's methods and results that he encouraged Doc to write a manual on school management. And so Doc did just that. He called the manual School Management, and he wrote it in 1750. But he wouldn't let his friend publish it until after he died. He didn't want the book to bring him about any fame. So it wasn't actually published for 20 years later until 1770. And it was the first book in the United States about how to best teach and impact students as an educator. And it impacted how schools functioned for decades afterwards. All because Christopher Doc was willing to devote his life to exploring a more nonviolent and reciprocal form of teaching. And now historians often call him the father of American pedagogy. This morning, I've shared 3 stories which highlight the unique way that Mennonites have again and again contributed to our society. We notice a gap in the world, which is allowing an injustice to continue and fester, and then we creatively attempt to fill that gap with something new and life-giving. To me, this is such a unique and powerful form of witness, and one that we often don't recognize enough. And these 3 stories, they're just a few of the examples that I could give of a much larger trend, and I'm sure you could add to it. From the victor offender reconciliation programs that were based off of restorative justice, to the Green Cross movement in the Netherlands, to the first fair trade store in the 1950s, to all the different peace and justice centers that Mennonite churches founded in the 70s and 80s. And I'm sure there's so much more we could add to this list. All of these were huge movements that made substantial changes to our worlds, all created by Mennonites to address injustices and to try to transform our world into something that is more healing and hopeful. And all of them, I believe, are tied to how we as Mennonites understand stewardship. For Mennonites, stewardship is about much more than what we do with our money. Stewardship centers on this idea that all of life, all this world is a gift from God. Stewardship centers on the belief that we as humans, that we've been created by God to tend to this world, to nurture it, to mend the cracks and find ways of making it more peaceful and just. I've mentioned this before, but one of my favorite early slogans that the Mennonites used over and over again was, "The earth is the Lord and all that is in it," from Psalm 24. They would repeat this slogan again and again whenever they saw the rich, the powerfuls, the rulers, the authorities, or anyone else acting unjustly and trying to take possession of something that they didn't believe was theirs. It was their way of reminding that this world has been made for everyone, and that we are called to seek the peace of wherever we find ourselves, as Jeremiah reminds us. For we are all stewards of God's creation. And we, just like Christopher Duck, the men and women who advocated for mental health, and Verbruge and de Klerk, we are called to work with God so that God's healing and hope can flow through us into our world. Amen.